Two, one, and I believe we're off to a start here. Hello, welcome, Daniel. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well, Dave. It is wonderful to see you today. I hope you're doing well. It's a pleasure to be here. Wonderful presentation from you and Ann. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Great to have you. So yeah, for people just joining, this is a sort of uh, follow up to something. It's not exactly the same as a post game because we're not going to be focused wholly the on what it was, but to say a couple things about it, I think would probably be important. So, what would you say was like the main theme and something that you would want to tell anyone who's so people don't feel the need to go watch it themselves? What did we talk about?
Well, an opportunity to listen to you and Ann speak and present for multiple hours would not be something I would
Things
want to
about
encourage
it.
people not to engage in for many, many hours. So, I really enjoyed it. I think one of the things is that all thinking is always already socially situated. And the reason for that, let's take someone like Goggins, who's, and there's a great inspiration to a gentleman like that, getting his act together and going and kind of being 300 pounds and doing everything he's accomplished. But then the question is the following. All right, that value of hard work, what social horizon are you going to situate it in? Because if you see a certain inspiration, but you then say, okay, hard work, well, I'm going to go and say participate in the capitalist system, well, then that may not necessarily follow, but you may not even realize that you just automatically associate applying that value to that social horizon because you've actually been socialized to do that. Where alternatively, like you were talking about, like someone like a Sartre actually kind of being a Goggins for like taking that hard drive into philosophy. That may not even occur to you to actually look at Goggins in a way that would make you maybe chart your own, dare I say, path, not in a disregard of others, but in a way that you don't do it according to a horizon of possibility that is always already situated, that you don't believe is always already situated. You don't even know that has occurred. And that's what I think a lot of the great sociologists are emphasizing. And one of the moves that you were also talking about that I think is very important, the
Mm,
sociologists understand, someone like Pierre understands very well that you really can't draw a hard line between the external and internal world.
mm,
Like the moment you go into yourself and you say, what do I believe? You're using English.
right.
You don't even realize that your inner voice is in English. That means there's already some sort of framing that's going on. Now, critically, the sociologists are not going to say that therefore it is wrong, or therefore it's arbitrary, or therefore you're trapped. And you're like, there's no agency whatsoever. But but like the way Peter Berger put it at the end of his introduction to sociology, which is a lovely text, he has a beautiful paragraph at the very end where he says, even if there is a sense in which the human subject is a kind of puppet, like there are certain strings pulling on us, the puppet that looks up and notices the strings, there is an agency in that now can be birthed because you are aware that you are always already socialized. And
Right.
so if you realize that, wait a minute, when I go to my inner voice and try to define my values and what I want to do, the very fact that it's actually in English, or the very fact that the kind of questions I'm asking of myself actually might be in an economic value system that had I not been in, I wouldn't be asking those particular questions, right?
Hmm.
Like the moment you ask, maybe I should be getting up at 4 a.m. There's a lot of advantages to getting up early. I'm not going to dispute that. But are you actually asking that because you've seen a bunch of YouTube videos of people talking about that to start the next big entrepreneurial thing? Or are you actually captivated by some sort of vision of your own values that believes the morning is perhaps the most beautiful time of day and you can create your own conditions of possibility because when you're up, you're able to engage in a certain way of interaction that otherwise you could not, right? Maybe for one person, getting up at 4 a.m. is that, but for another person, it's just part of the grind that's actually removing their agency all while they think they're owning it. So the idea that your inner voice and your inner decisions, if you will, they're not necessarily free. They're already situated within certain values, within certain ideas, a certain social unconscious, as we were talking about in different things. Now again, that doesn't mean you don't have any agency. But it does mean that if you don't realize your agency is socialized, then whatever good ideas or maybe purposes or different things that you have, you may unintentionally actually plug them up into a horizon that then takes you in a direction you don't even want to go in or realize you're going in because you didn't acknowledge the all always already present socialization that's even there in your inner voice. And so that's really important. And then to close, as another thought, there's a way in which Goggins puts forth a certain power that comes from being able to plug up your enjoyment to something extraordinary, right? Like he's able to plug up his enjoyment, his this kind of, he's like, it's almost a way that what Goggins has done is he's taken his enjoyment and found an enjoyment in the suffering of these marathons and all these things, right? And he's able to do incredible things. They're absolutely incredible things. Now, if other people think it's show off or whatever, all that aside, it's incredible. I've never been able to do anything like that. I can't imagine. I think he had like 4,000 freaking pull-ups or something. It's unbelievable. And he is able to take his enjoyment and put it in that direction. The probability of one having any control at all, or any even beginning to think, how would we design a society or communities where we have any sort of say or control on what our enjoyment gets hooked up on, is far less if you're not aware of the social unconscious. Because there's something about the ability to have your enjoyment be, say, plugged up into philosophy, as opposed to something perhaps more just buying products to be happy or something, like the enjoyment of self-deception that comes from just infinite consumption. If the human being has any sort of possibility of being to actually plug up their enjoyment into something, we're not even going to be able to think that or begin talking about designing conditions of possibility unless we're aware of the social unconscious. So those were some thoughts that I was thinking about through the lecture, and both you and Anne did a tremendous job. I always enjoy Anne's work. And hey, then if we're thinking about the idea of the university, what would it mean to have a university that's thinking about what kind of conditions do we have to create to increase the probability that people have some sort of agency over what their enjoyment kind of attaches to? It's almost like there's a funny way in which enjoyment, if it's tied to a kind of death drive, it's almost like death drive, if you're not conscious of it at all, just leads to, maybe self-effacement, or you could just get lucky and it'd be attached to something like Goggins. But there's also a kind of like way in which that can be what you're willing to die for drive. Like what you're willing to die for drive, right? Could you plug it up to philosophy? Could you plug it up to community? Could you plug it up to time energy? Could you plug it up to your own works? If that's possible at all, which I think would also get into the work of Ivan Illich, and Brian's lecture on Illich was tremendous. My goodness. I think that is talking about opening a different possibility, because there's that great paradox in Illich on how do you plan for a better future if technological thinking is in fact planning? Like if you're trying to escape the tyranny of technological thinking, which is something to do with the ability to kind of plan and think of all possibilities, well, then you can't plan yourself out of a capture of epistemology that is plan-based, right? So that's where Illich's like, you have to hope more. We need more hope, right? We need to be able to dwell in conditions of possibility. Well, is there a way to dwell that would incubate us in a manner that we are formulated alternative to a social unconscious we're not aware is there? Because if we're not aware it's there, our enjoyment is probably just going to get plugged up into things that we find enjoyment in the self-destructions of capital. So it was a tremendous presentation.
Right. And so I don't think people realize how much baggage they bring into their personality through these objective social structures that become internalized. And I think that element of what habitus actually is, and also how it's necessary. Habitus is necessary for navigating certain fields. So it's not fully conscious. And so it's like, you actually need that. And so it's like, I almost feel like making people too self-aware of their habitus might make it so people aren't able to inhabit certain fields. It could be a form of like terrorism. It's a form of like making people overly neurotic about entering certain spaces and stuff like that. And it's like, hey man, like we just have to pretend that, at a sort of functional, like practical level, like that's, we got to kind of leave that out of the interpersonal when we're actually engaging with one another to some degree, because we have to play the believing game with one another, because I shouldn't be assuming that there's a psychoanalytic or critical social structural force operative behind every one of your speech acts while we're having a conversation here. I have to kind of believe that there is a person at the steering wheel here, and not just at the steering wheel, but also that it's not just like this completely prefabricated map, right? And so, and I think of it as a map. Like habitus is like sort of, you have mapped the territory, you have a feel for the game, for the you have a field for the field, you have a feel for the field, right? And that kind of is how Bourdieu was talking about it when he talked. If you just look up particles, I don't know, somewhere in the field of cultural production, you'll find what I'm talking about. But he talks about like people are kind of like particles, like metal little particles inside of like a field that is going to have different magnetic forces, and so like depending on like the actual metabolic makeup and magnetization and structure of those little shavings, they're going to react in different ways. But then he's like, but hey, I don't want anybody to get it twisted. I'm not saying that everybody is determined. I'm saying everybody has these maps that they're operating on, and these maps are precognitive to some degree, and they feel like they're internally motivated. But obviously, these are sort of like mirrors of like, it's almost behavioral, but it's not. And so the behaviorists are getting at something, the determinists are getting at something. But I do like that he still allows for that agency, and I do also just want to remind everybody, you can get way too lost in the theory sauce and then start assuming everything coming out of a person's mouth is just this, empty speech. And it's like, well, maybe you're not paying attention, or maybe you come from a different field than they do. And so you actually don't know from where they're speaking. Right. But I have a question. So Goggins, everybody who has heard us so far, you should be well enough aware of who he is. And if you're not, then definitely check out Anne's lecture. You're not going to find a better introduction to Goggins. It's awesome. Now, with him kind of on the table here for conversation, it's like the big question for me, and I would have this question for him as well if I were to speak to him, would just be like, man, look, you're killing yourself. Repeatedly, you're killing yourself so that you can be the best. And in doing so, you are overcoming that 300-pound version of yourself that you think was such a loser. And you're doing that so that a little kid like yourself, growing up in an abusive, dysfunctional household, who sees you on TV or on YouTube or hears you on the Joe Rogan Experience, is going to go, there's hope for me. Like I can get out of this situation. I can better myself. So he's speaking to his fat self. He's speaking to his younger self. And he's also, putting it to the people who are telling him that, oh, he's bad, or that they don't like him or whatever. And so he's doing all of these things at once, but like the role model part is the sort of ideal ego. And he explains that when he says, I mean, it comes through when he tells Joe Rogan that when he, people, they say all the time, that he loves to run, or that he's a masochist, he enjoys the pain. And he's like, no, I fucking don't. Like I sit here, sometimes I procrastinate for hours just hating the thought of getting up and going on that run. Right. But where am I going with this? It is his ideal ego is the fantasy of being a role model, and he lets that go through when he's saying he's sitting there trying to talk himself out of going on this run, and he's like, oh, but then he's no, I should go on this run because people look up to me, and then he goes, fuck that. So he's arguing with himself, and there's this part of him that's saying, people look up to me, I have to do it, and then there's this part of him that says, fuck that. And then he's identifying that part of him that says, fuck that, with that 300-pound version of himself that he's so embarrassed to have been. And here's the thing. It's like, would he, as that 300-pound version of himself, or as, say, his 7-year-old self in an abusive household, actually have looked up to himself right now, though? Considering the fact that he's pushing himself so hard that he can be nothing but cut, that he can be nothing but like this peak athletic he can't have a life. It's almost like that's the thing, is like he's setting the bar so high. I feel like just though it might motivate a bunch of people, I feel like it's going to dismotivate just as many people. And as many people as say that they've had their lives turned around because of this, you might have that many people, maybe a lot of them the same people, that have burnt out. Because they're trying to go full Goggins and they don't have the time energy. They think they do, but they don't. And he's kind of convinced them that they do. So the question is, killing yourself to become a role model as a way of getting out of being what you don't like. What do you think about it? I don't want to say is it good or is it bad, but what do you think about it? This dynamic.
I think it's an excellent question. So I think you're pointing to what to me has to be the beginning of basically all serious thought of the 21st century, which is tragedy, a trade-off of competing goods, and there are no things that are entirely good and no things that are entirely bad. And honestly, this is the revelation of sociology that you were pointing at, on the notion that human beings require maps. That's very odd. That means human beings require Zizek objective fictions, right? These kind of fictions, like, it's the fetish that Shahil was talking about so well. Like, capital works even if you don't believe in it, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why it's oppressive, but that's also why, in a way, it's wonderful, because you don't have to, it works for you. There's a system there for you, but that thing that works without you also oppresses you. But here's the problem. There's an objective question of what human beings do without maps when they encounter diversity and difference. Well, if we go through our Tocquevilles or Louis Demons, the tremendous presentation on the Cultural Revolution under Mao at one time, talking about how if you release people to their own devices, they tend to eat each other because they're not necessarily ready to have a mapless society, right? But if you have a map, you're susceptible to capture. This is the severity of the problem. So the other thing, like you're talking about the role model, here's the problem with the role model. The role model, in the very act of inspiration, also provides a feeling of disempowerment. Because once you know the world, and this is especially multiplied with mass media, once a person enters the world, like a Goggins, who shows that that is possible, well, then it's possible to do that. So why aren't you? And so the thing of inspiration reflects on what you could do. The fact that you're not now, you feel guilty and you're disheartened, right? Anytime a human being does something in the world, that suggests you could maybe do it as well. And if you can't, you at least have to enter the mental gymnastics or the thinking of why can't you, and it's okay. With every possibility that's realized, there is a question of why you don't realize it as well, which puts a cognitive strain on you, maybe for good, maybe for bad. But if you don't have a society that is trained in cognitive strains, ergo the gem of philosophy and abstract reasoning and different things, then the experience of the different ways that people choose to live their lives ultimately tends to be more on the side of disempowering than inspiring. Because in order, all exemplars, all role models can both be a source of inspiration or a source of disempowerment. How do you have people be a source of inspiration and not disempowerment? Well, that's up to you, your own ability to choose how you interpret them. If you look at a Goggins and you say, I don't want to be that way, you have to be comfortable enough in your skin and your own choice to be able to do that. And if other people are talking about him, or you're going to the culture and they're talking about him, you have to be okay with the nervousness of not even being able to do 20 pull-ups, right? Because he's entered the social horizon, right? But that means people have to be able to stand for their own choices, to choose to be like X person or Y person or not. And this is what the sociologists are all stressing. We make and this is where neoliberalism failed in a real respect. The idea of neoliberalism is that what your neighbor chooses to do doesn't affect you. Everyone should just be free to choose whatever they want to do, et cetera, so forth. No, it very much affects you. If you know that your neighbor is living X way and you're living Y way, then you reflect on yourself. Even if your neighbor doesn't judge you, you reflect on yourself and the choices you've made, and it creates an anxious relationship with your own choices, simply knowing that other people are making different choices. You cannot simply brainwash yourself or just convince yourself, don't think about it. No, the reason you can't do that is precisely the social unconscious. You can't think unsocialized. So if people in the society are making different choices, that very difference is the background of your thinking. And so you can't think yourself out of the realization of that difference because it composes the background of which makes thinking possible. But this would require, if life, and I do think so, basically, and then I'll give it back to you.
Mm,
Sociology began to emerge really as a serious field. And I'm not saying that the topics of sociology have not been with us since the beginning of time, but
right.
really a lot of people like a Randall Collins will talk about the 19th century with around Marx, with your kind of people like that. And it's tied with industrialization, global trade, and things like that. That's where sociology really explodes onto the field because people start thinking about societies meta, like as their own units. They reflect on society because they see that obviously there were always the Silk Roads, and actually the cross-pollination between the Persian Empire and Europe is much greater than people realize. The book called The Silk Roads by Peter Floribon, that's really good. There's a new book I've been learning about on how the world made the West that's outstanding. So cross-pollination is extremely strong. But even if
Hmm.
that's true, if that gets erased in your history, you still, when your neighbor, the person that lives next to you, is different than you, then the reality of difference becomes tangible to the average person on planet Earth, not just the tradesman, not just the navigation, not just the
Mm,
kings. And so then society is thought about reflectively, right? But what ended up happening is rather than going like really in a way, as I try to talk about it belonging again, we're really at the age where we have to actually face the problems of sociology that started to emerge in the 19th century that we then ran from, because the reason we ran from it is we let capital run in and do our sociology for us. And that's what Marx understood so well, because the way we relate to difference now is simply the capital form, fungibility, right? All the stuff Shahil was saying, the fetish, right? We have not actually come to, as human beings, be comfortable with difference.
mm,
And here's the other trick: the necessity of objective fictions, the necessity of maps. That's really weird. We're not trained for this because we're trained to think in terms of objective subject, which of course is false, inner outer, which of course is false. If it's human created, then it can't have authority to us, right? It's like it's just
mm,
made. Because neoliberalism kind of wouldn't allow that because everyone's choices are their own choices. It's supposed to be a private affair. But if you start saying, well, no, actually, human beings need to create objective fictions like the capital form, like the nation state identity, all of which, of course, can be used by totalitarian to control. But if you remove that, human beings are existentially overwhelmed. So what it would mean is that if we take sociology seriously, we become really good at creating objective fictions. We become really good at creating environments that formulate us differently. Thus, we have a different habitus, and we actually own the environments we create to work on our unconscious differently. But to close the point, we've only thought about creating ourselves as individuals differently. We haven't thought about creating environments that incubate in us different kinds of subjectivity. And the difference is we're still thinking too much in terms of information, not enough in terms of formulation, which is something James K.A. Smith says that I think is also what Ivan Illich understood. And also, too, if you are still formulated within a certain social horizon, then you can withdraw into yourself all you want. You can be a role model all you want. You will be a role model that assumes that value form, that assumes that horizon. And so that's the issue. We really have to be comfortable with the fact that people are different, that we have different values, and then not be overwhelmed by existential anxiety, knowing about that difference, and then critically knowing our neighbors know about the possibility of us being like Goggins and us not. That's really what gets us. It's not so much us knowing that we can't do 4,000 push-ups that drive us nuts in isolations. It's being around other people who know we can't do that. And yet we know about someone like Goggins. Why aren't you like reading his books and being like him? Don't you know about him? That's when we withdraw. That's when we cut away from community because of the judgment of the other. Or even if they're not judging us, just knowing they might be results in a
mm.
withdrawal, a pulling back. But of course, what does that do? Well, then you insulate, then you withdraw to the interior space that is already formatted by capital, and thus you can't change conditions of possibility. That withdrawal then ruins the possibility of different forms of dwelling. So I think Goggins, what everything you're saying points to the inescapability of tragedy. of having to deal with these kind of live situations. For every role model, there's also a discouragement. For every image of beauty, there's also a replica that makes you lose the ability of beauty because you're overly saturated with imagery, right? Everything has this double-sidedness, and the only way to deal with that double-sidedness is to become subjects who can handle it and make choices in light of that difference and be able to handle that other people make different assessments.
It's weird because we think that, like, because Goggins is the one who broke that record with pull-ups at one point, or because he ran 70 miles without any training or anything like this, we think that that makes them someone who's more trustworthy or inspirational, when, I don't know, like, I have to imagine that there's people who didn't finish those races or whatever, who are like, they're just like a slightly lesser Goggins who just keeps trying and is just like never really getting it. But also, like, you'd be like, you wouldn't look up to them the same way because they're not the one who got through the filter, because there's this filter of effort buffers. And it's like, well, it is cool to see a person put out crazy effort and get to the other side of some high stakes effort buffer. But also there's other kinds of things that a human can do or be. And I guess to me, I see specialization, and it's like, yeah, I don't know. We all have to learn how to be specialist generalists today. But some people, it feels like they don't. They just go all in on something, and then people take inspiration from it. And it's like, well, but is it though? Like this lifestyle where you're putting everything in that direction. I like, if we were to replace the body with like some kind of representation of like what's going on inside of their brain, for instance, a lot of people who look very attractive would probably just look like a dumpster. Who knows? But also, we can't tell from the outside, right? And so we'll sit there and play these projection games and assume we don't know. We literally can't know. And I think that this gets to that essential insecurity about this person who's so high achieving. You're like, oh, I could do that too, or I should do that. And they feel this weird pressure. And then it's like, obviously, like, ressentiment is a factor. It's like, well, one of the easiest way to get rid of this feeling of, oh, I should also do that, is to be like, no, actually, that shit's lame. And so it's like, oh, Goggins, well, running. Why would anyone run? And I have seen this a lot, in the last 6 months, And so, yeah, role models can bring inspiration and disempowerment. And then you were talking about the withdrawal that can come from the disempowerment that comes with difference when we haven't been, our institutions don't help us be comfortable with difference. And that causes this retreat. Well, then we can also bring in the fact that humans already kind of have this sort of superficial tendency, like, towards, we run from complexity or difficulty if it's not something that we've mastered, and we do that by going into non-committally curious, ambiguous idle chatter, right? Kierkegaard on that, but also the virtuous circle between solicitude and solitude that breaks down when we can't be genuinely with ourselves, and then we can't be genuinely with other people, and then we're alone even when we're with other people, and we're alone even when we're with ourselves. And then you're always anxious, and you're always kind of, well, that's due to also material objective conditions. We could also then say, maybe it's not just that. Maybe it's other stuff that's not reducible to that. But it is also actually that is fundamental in terms of the structure of society, making it so you don't have time energy, making it so that other people don't, meaning that it's not between you. If we don't have it between us, then how are we going to talk? You and I both could kind of do this because we both have like non-regular jobs, and we're able to kind of like juggle and make it work. But like, a lot of people just can't do certain things a lot of times of the week. And then the times of the week that they do have, they are straight up exhausted, right? But also, exhaustion comes from not feeling renewed. And if the labor power recreation processes that you are involved in are not really renewing you, then that's going to be even a bigger problem. And so I'm just seeing the way that this withdrawal into solitude, but then that breaks down because solitude and solicitude have broken down, how that creates this vicious loop, with this downward sort of gravitational force. And then people will just kind of like, be like Goggins when he was 300 pounds, just, going with it and hating themselves. But then when they flip the switch and they say, I'm not going to hate myself anymore, I'm going to go hard. It is like it's this all or nothing. And so like part of my question then is asking, do you think that it is all or nothing? For someone like Goggins, is it not taking over his actual life versus taking over his actual life? Like this is pretty much these are the two options? Or is there like some kind of a different ideal and also accomplishable sort of achievement that someone like him could go for that would still be like I don't know. Do you think it's all or nothing?
That's an outstanding question. So there's a few things that come to mind. First off, I think it's very important when you look at someone like a Goggins. There's two ways you can look at that, and it's kind of almost a phenomenological like on the idea of what are the conditions necessary for having X kind of experience. Instead of asking, I think with role models, how can I do what he did? Instead, ask, what were the ways that he created motivation for himself to enter a certain drive? And I think you were actually getting, it's very important that there's a way in which he's always like, F you, F you, I'm not going to be like that. There's a certain, like a transgress, like the world wants me to be like this way. And I say, no, I'm not going to be that way. You've said it a few times. And I think this is very important. What's the power of a deadline? That you can transgress it. And there's an energy that comes from a certain transgression, right? I'm supposed to do X. Well, suddenly I have the motivation to read all of friggin' Heidegger because I know I'm supposed to do my taxes tomorrow. And we've all had that. And actually learning the art of moving between transgressions can be a very powerful way to get stuff done, right? Rather, I think actually he shows that. That would be the kind of, instead of trying to replicate an individual, like I love reading biographies. I think biographies are incredible, but instead of saying, I want to equal this person, which would be the fungibility thing, what are the tricks of the trade that they did to get them out of the traps of motivation or to loosen their thinking? Like, in that wonderful biography on Keynes, it is extremely clear that one of the great ways you find the tension between specialization and generalization is to put yourself in the midst of a generalist group of people. Virginia Woolf, Rutschel, he's specializing in economics. But while he has that focus, he's in an environment that he cannot help but be a generalist as well. But he's this is the trick. If he as an individual has to choose between generalism and specialism, it doesn't seem like you can do that. But why don't I let my environment do my general for me as I focus on a particular passion, like the role of demand in economics, right? And I'm going to surround myself, though, like I think Virginia Woolf, they were like, that was like, I think she even said, well, the husband, like best friends, like really close, right? That might be an overstatement, but that's kind of weird, right? Like why? And yet, so there's a way in which one of the things I think if we take formulation seriously is you need to, as a subject, if a lot of either or choices, you cannot solve except by making the other option in your environment. Like you make the generalization enter your environment because we do have a danger. There's two ditches. You overly generalize, so you're shallow, or you're specialized and you're siloed, right? Like you can be deep and go nowhere, or you can have a lot of distance and be shallow. So how do you do both? That sounds kind of weird because it seems like active choosing. And how can you ever know if you put the right ingredients in the right order in the right time and then your brain blows up or something? Well, one of your tactics by which to do that is actually to think about your environment, surrounding yourself with people who are going to have conversations about literature that then cannot help. And they're like world experts in literature. It's Virginia Woolf, for frick's sake. That's then entering your mind. And then your focus, your specialization gets a generalist flavor without making itself shallow. And also, too, I think there's actually secretly a transgression there as well, because an economist isn't supposed to hang out with philosophers and literary people. That right there has a kind of transgressive character to it that leads to a certain motivation. So the point is, I think one of the mistakes is that people try to be like role models instead of asking what were the conditions that made the exemplar possible. Like, what do we see going
Yeah.
below the surface that I could do? Well, transgressive motivation, as you call it, is indeed a big secret. One of the other things you see is an awareness of different kinds of energy at different times of day. Seems like people are more right brain in the morning, and as the day progresses, they move toward the left brain. That's, of course, a generality. We cannot apply that to everyone else, but when you read biographies, getting up in the morning, being able, that seems to be a space when you're able to really think creatively. But as you get to noon, you should be working in the garden and fixing your car, right? You should not be fixing your car in the morning. You should be doing it in the afternoon, and you should be editing in the evening. Now, that's a general rubric. But what I learned from reading those biographies is paying attention to that. A lot of the most creative and brilliant people are really aware at their energy flows and how it differs at different times of day. So
Mm.
there's a tool there you want to pay attention to. Not saying, how do I write like Virginia Woolf? No, 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 no. Don't try to write like Virginia Woolf. Apparently, taking walks is really useful in the afternoon. Maybe you should take, instead of being like Virginia Woolf, you should do there's something about taking walks, apparently. And maybe long bath, I think she like at 10 a.m. every morning took like a long bath, and she actually had like out loud dialogues with herself to get herself in the place where she was in her stories, like waves or different things. So for me that's very important, to kind of not be trying to equal the exemplar, but to think about kind of the methods that you see with that kind of transgressive energy that one can be using to kind of push forth with Goggins and different things. I think also what it also would suggest too is that if you don't, if you're not though aware of like why exactly you are doing X, Y, and Z, because you want to like get back at the man, or you want to internalize to create your own way, but you actually don't do it from the right place, then actually what's going to end up happening is, in the name of getting your life together, you may engage in this withdrawal that then is exactly what pulls you out of involvement in the society to change politically and different things. And let me put it this way, because on this question of solitude and withdrawal and the anxiety from difference in humans trying to avoid complexity and
Mm.
different things. So, we know that Zizek famously is concerned about kind of Western Buddhism as this erasing of the ego, this kind of self-symmetry inside, where you withdraw to the self and therefore you can't make any political difference, right? Um, Fascinating enough, aesthetics, symbolism, the distinctions, these things are very often in human history actually used to make people withdraw in that way. It's not just the Western Buddhism. So for example, one of the people that Pierre advised in the book, Emiko, Emiko, did a fascinating book on the symbolism of the cherry blossom with kamikaze fighters. And Mr. Samuel Barnes, who wrote a tremendous book called The Iconoclast, brought this to my attention. And the idea of the cherry blossom, it becomes a symbol of beauty, of transience, and the most beautiful person is a kind of transient individual. And so the kamikaze fighter is identifying with the aesthetics of the cherry blossom, and that actually functions to convince them to go out with the suicide bombing, right? Now, what's very interesting in that book is that a lot of the pilots, because it's all full of these journals of these different pilots that were willing to go through, they didn't buy the symbolism at all. They thought it was ridiculous. They didn't do it for the emperor. And yet they knew that they were seen by the society in light of that cherry blossom. And so they had no choice but to define themselves in light of it. So what they did is they withdrew to find a certain rationalization of how they could. This is the way, it's kind of like, how Pierre talks about the field, right? There's a way in which you can say is that an aesthetic makes you inwardly range yourself. You're inwardly ranged by this kind of symbolism of the cherry blossom. And even if you think it's ridiculous, you're still paralyzed from rebelling against it because the aesthetic captures you within it, and you don't want to be seen as dishonorable because you're not analogously like the cherry blossom. And you see also too what ends up happening, like the great Matthew Stanley talking about the novel Silence with Endo, on the idea that the private faith in religion, your private relationship with Jesus, well, that withdraws you to a private belief that makes you not have any political role, and then you just accept the oppression of the Japanese over the Japanese, the oppression of the empire over the Japanese people. And so like the witchcraft in South Africa as an aesthetic, the South race as an objective fiction, all of these show that aesthetics and objective fictions in general have functioned to make people go inward, where
Mm.
even if they think the aesthetic is ridiculous, it still has causal impact on them, like the fetish, like Shihil was saying. Even if you know that, like, even if you don't believe in witches, knowing that witchcraft is a concept in South Africa changes how you behave socially because you know somebody may see you as a witch. Knowing that other people believe in race, even if you think it's a construct, forces you to act aware of it, right? Like you'll see that in Charles W. Mills, the great Jamaican philosopher in Blackness Visible, talking about this notion of basically race as an objective fiction, right? So here's the rub. Basically, throughout history, we have seen aesthetics having a massive impact on how subjects act in a manner that has kind of imprisoned them. The question we have to ask today is, well, knowing that aesthetics, symbolism, sociology, institutions can do that, what if we were to actually, aware of that reality, use them to increase freedom, to increase new formulations and value forms, as opposed to being formed by them? But you see, in order for that possibility to open up, you have to see objective fictions as some things you can work with, not things as opposed that you say, well, they're just kind of fictions created by the society, therefore they don't exist. And this is the problem. Most of sociology has been about identifying a lot of the, I've called it conspiratorial sociology, power spotting sociology, has been about spotting power and saying that's injustice and getting rid of it, versus saying, wow, let's look at history to see how power operates. How do we use power in that way to empower ourselves to be different kinds of subjects who actually can handle difference, that can actually have different value forms, and can operate according to different forms of motivation that are not just extrinsically set by the capital market. So there's actually in sociology, in having these revelations about how aesthetics work, how power work, and all these things actually do point to a possibility of how we can operate and think about community today that would allow us to formulate differently. But we have to face the anxiety of seeing them as groundless, right? You have to face the anxiety of going, oh my gosh, all of these things are groundless. Oh wow, what can I believe? Oh my gosh, what can I believe? Anything. If that's how you act in response to objective like fictions, seeing them and being paralyzed, well, that's a withdrawal too. That's the joke. Like this kind of anxiety withdrawal of seeing it as all social construct is exactly then in service of the capital nation state, right? Because you're withdrawn. You just withdraw into a certain anxiety. So that's not the correct response to the revelation of social contracts and sociologies, because it's ironically in the identification of those withdrawals into the self that aesthetics can cause that make people then politically irrelevant. That in of itself can cause a withdrawal of anxiety of feeling like nothing matters, which means in the meta move, you're actually still making the same mistake. And so that is what we've got to not do today, I think.
That's what we got to not do.
Yeah, got to not do. I'm showing my class. You know, that's the distinction. Pierre would be proud, right? It's to the book.
Yeah. Well, so you typed, you kind of grouped distinction, symbolism, and aesthetics, and I'm very fascinated by this because it feels like, kind of like with that word rhetoric, you're using aesthetics in a way that I don't normally encounter it, right? And so I'm wondering, so it sounds to me like you're basically understanding aesthetics in a Bourdieuian vein, or as you're calling him, Pierre, which I love. Yeah, let's call him Pierre. And so Pierre, from my standpoint, then that would just mean it's the study of the symbolic, structural, historically encoded fields and habituses that form in, I would say, a class society, but also probably in any society. You're going to have like these various formations. And then, of course, we were talking about how complicated this is once we bring it into the 21st century through figures like Heidegger and Lacan, and thinking about how I think he said that every field has its own habitus. And every institution has at least one field. And then there's, of course, the fields between institutions. And so that's really interesting to think about. Then, of course, there's probably lots of fields within any institution, right? And so that means that, like, if a habitus is at some level the social unconscious, well, then we've just set up the ability to say that there's like a a broad field. We could say an institution-wide field. So we could say at the university. And then within that field, there's the field of administration. And then there might be subfields within the field of administration. Well, in the same way, there's going to be all of the actually scholarly fields, right? And the different schools, disciplines, departments, and then the interesting sort of relations between all of those. Now, this idea of like field and subfield, I actually don't know off the top of my head. This is one of my big questions as I'm studying Bourdieu this year, is like, okay, so does he talk about it that way? Is it like a set thing? Is there like a sort of set theory of fields? And then because we have different people coming from different institutions, but also like if one person spends their off time watching Netflix and another person spends their off time watching Amazon Prime and another person spends their off time reading the Bible and another person spends their off time playing video games with their kids. Like we have a bunch of different options of like how people are spending their pastime. Other people are at the dog park or hiking. So it's just like if every one of those is a field with its own habitus, then that gets at why people feel so isolated, I think, and so kind of like everything's atrophying or whatever, because, but then also I would say that there's probably a lot of people like me who don't experience it as badly because we're in so many fields. So this opens up several cans of worms, but like the main one that I'm thinking about is an institutional grid that people spend most of their lives going through. And even if they go to the national park, they're in another institution, right? And that means the highway is an institution. So it's like, well, then is there just like a broad social unconscious, we just call it America, and then we could talk about Idaho versus Virginia. Every state has its own field, but then we could just keep going down. But then we could start talking about the different fields of the different institutions within these different places. Okay, but is there some kind of like a universal human field that's, can we talk about some kind of a universal field out that's there for everybody? Like, is there a set of all sets? Like it, I don't know. Like this is just like, I've not really had this conversation with anybody yet. I'm looking forward to having it with Mikey here soon. We're going to be doing a co-lecture on the second Sunday of July, and he'll be talking about the superego versus the big other and how they're different. And he's written basically a book on each one of these faculties. I mean, they're probably chapters from a book to a book, really. But with all that said, like I'll be continuing my Bourdieu in that lecture, and yeah, I don't know, habitus, a plurality of habituses, but they're also maybe going through a blender all of the time, except for a handful of people who are able to really hunker down and maintain a very, I imagine some people have a somewhat stable life and a normal sort of routine, but they're hard for me to imagine because I just don't know a lot of people like that.
No, outstanding. So there's a few things. So there's a question of, one of the reasons I talk about aesthetics, because, I was speaking with Jock on the notion that aesthetics mean just the study of art, but aesthetics is also tied to a notion of fittedness. When I look at something like, let's take a table, I'll use a Roger Scruton example. When you look at a table, there's a notion of what a set table looks like. There's a certain aesthetic that a nice table is supposed to meet. And if it doesn't meet that aesthetic, it is not a nice table, right? The word aesthetic entails a certain analogy, a certain AB, like nice table is this category. Does this fall under that category or not analogously? Can I compare it, right? The critical thing is what a lot of the sociologists understood is, although we talk about facts and experience, basically there is always already a meta judgment, if you grant me that, underneath it, an analogous assessment of that thing, of which makes it intelligible. Like you never look at a cup as simply a cup. You experience, the moment I say cup, I am analogously comparing that phenomenon with a category of cup, of which, here's the weird thing, is actually a result of that very analogous process. And this is where there's a fascinating book, and this may get to the set of all sets question, Douglas Hofstadter, who did that Gödel-Bach-esque book, he wrote a
mm.
really good book, my favorite of his, called Surfaces and Essences, with a man named Sander, Sander. And the argument they would like to make is that all thinking, all intelligibility is analogous. There is no such thing as thinking that is not analogous. But this means we understand things in light of a thing that is not there. We are able to say this is a cup because of something that is not located in facticity, the category of cup, of which is arisen to because I have had experiences of cups that I'm like, they're kind of always phenomenon that are like cups are always like this. The likeness is the analogy, and we form categories by likeness, and then the categories become things that reinforce the analogy, and then the category expands and moves and changes relative to our experiences. The term they use is halo. It's like an expanding halo, and it closes. And of course, this aligns with Hegel's passing into otherness, right? This is very similar to Hegel on the notion that A is always located in a passing into B. If I ask you what is a tree, what are you going to have to talking about? Leaves and branches and roots. Tree passes over into other things that are necessary to understand a tree, and yet tree is not reducible to, right? So all intelligibility has a passing over element. It has an analogous movement, and this gets into where someone like a Derrida or Krisky or Wittgenstein, when they say language is like a free-floating play of the signifier, right? And they're critiquing this notion of dictionary understanding of language, right? Well, that's what they're, language forms analogously. But here's the trick. That means language forms by a certain judgment, a certain meta judgment, where you say, and you just do it so quick that you don't realize it's going on, right? You say, that's a cup. There's actually a meta judgment that just happened. An analogy occurred that you don't even realize occurred. But guess what? But we say, oh, it's just a fact. Well, then you miss the aesthetic move. Aesthetics is analogy. That's why I use the term aesthetics. Aesthetics always point beyond themselves to something that they are fitted relative to. But that's different than a fact. But of course, the trick is that facts are always actually concealing a aesthetic that they fit into, a fittedness, right? Because facts don't tell you what they mean. Facts don't tell you what worldview they fit into. If you say that's a fact, well, then there's a certain understanding of reality in which that is a fact. Now, that doesn't mean it is false, but that means what we understand as a fact is already pointing beyond itself into the worldview that's situated as a fact. And this is why this is very important. The reason capital was so successful is because it is an economic system that taps into our already pre-existing tendency of analogy. That's why it works so freaking well. That's because we already use analogy to understand everything. We talked about the Leibniz situation, the metageometrical. That's what capital does. You say that cup. It's $10. That's analogy. I make that cup intelligible because I'm saying it is $10. All intelligibility requires an analogous move, and habitus reflects a range of analogous judgments that everyone else around you shares, that you all do so quickly that you don't even realize you're doing it. So it becomes factual. It becomes part of everything. A habitus is a reflection of a collective shared series of analogous judgments of a certain fittedness. Oh, that has the aesthetic of cup. You're judging an aesthetic. This looks like a cup. So it falls under a certain category. We're always doing this. That looks like it's worth $10. That looks like it. Because what does Pierre talk about? Like the middle class looks like if you're middle class, you're supposed to wear a certain outfit. You have blue jeans, a truck. And if if I say America, then there's an aesthetic you think of more so. This is the key. We think of aesthetics more than before we think of language. We actually, how they talk about, and this is why so much rests on aesthetics, like the ability to formulate our aesthetics, to choose what's formulated. It's not about information. Like we don't tend to think about the world in terms of ideas, but images. Like we mostly think in terms of images. We associate McDonald's. Why do we associate America with McDonald's? Because you've seen a McDonald's. You've seen one. You've seen it everywhere you go. That information has meaning to you in that association because of experiences you have had that formulated your expectations, that formulated your judgments about what you expect to judge to see when somebody talks about a place as America. And then it functions as a feedback loop of which then forms a habitat. So here's the issue. One of the reasons why you actually can find a freedom if you have multiple habituses is because the mechanism of judgment becomes visible to you. because in the movement between them, you see that people can make different analogous judgments. They can make different value judgments, which then makes the mechanism aware to you, which means, and this is why freedom is found there, you're not removing the meta judgment. I just called it a meta judgment in the book. You're not removing the meta judgment because it's fun to throw meta in front of words. If you do that, you get like a cookie. You get a cookie. It's meta geometrical judgment. It's
You
kind of
get
a meta analysis.
you get
You get a meta, and you get a meta, and you get a
one
meta.
cultural capital credit to you, sir.
I made up my country slur a little bit ago with the language meta. I use meta now, so I'm good. With y'all in different things. So here's the thing. Like, most people would be like, you don't find freedom in the removal of meta judgment or maps, because that leads to anxiety, chaos, and you can't relate to anyone, and then you'll have to withdraw. Like, in a way, there's a funny way in which, although technically you still need a map if you're isolated, practically speaking, the map can be invisible to you because it never bumps up against anything, right? So there's a sense in which you don't live with a map if you never interact with other people. It's the other who's actually different that makes your map visible to you. And the same way, it's the other that makes your habitats visible to you. And that's what Peter Berger and them, that's the beginning of agency. But that means the beginning of agency is precisely an anxiety. And this is what, Zizek is talking about with the curse of freedom or whatever in his new book. Like, anxiety, groundlessness is the beginning of freedom. But basically, if you cannot free that, and then I'll give it back to you. If you cannot face that freedom, then there's no possibility of being free from the meta judgment that you have been habitated into of capital. So I think basically the set of all set is the human need for analogy in order to have intelligibility, that then all habitats make little, under that umbrella, make little various meta judgments that the brain needs in order to make sense of things, and that variety of things. So what we need to get good at, we need to have control over our analogies, the formation of our analogy, the formations of our categories of intelligibility. We need to be aware of the social unconscious that we are participating through our meta judgments, so that then the very means of intelligibility, like you talk about clear, with Sheets, the Heideggerian scholar, talking about like the conditions of intelligibility itself. Intelligibility is analogy. A clearing, in a way, is a place where you can be aware of that analogous operation, precisely because the act of annihilation makes naked the mechanism of the meta judgment. And then once you face that, you can then choose the things that habituate you, choose the environment that forms habitats, and yet let them have authority over you. So those are some thoughts.
Right. And I want to clarify, because I know you know this, but also just for anybody just popping in, hearing us talk about maps, we're not talking about explicit maps. I don't even mean like everyone knows we're not talking about maps that you hold, but also
an atlas.
But a person might have the idea that you have a conscious, sort of principled way of dealing in situations, such as, I like to assume the best in people. That's a map. Yeah, well, it is a sort of protocol, but the conditions of possibility that make that protocol intelligible in the first place are what we're talking about. This is a map at the level of circumspection, which is to say it is the background to anything that is an intentional object or act. And so, so I wanted to first touch on that. And then your proposal that the set of all sets is the fundamental, the fact of everything being analogous. It's a fact. Okay. Yeah, here we go. But I wanted to point out that is basically like what Jacobi says. And that's who Lacan is drawing from, for his sort of like Saussurean semiotics, like update. But basically Jacobi's like, yeah, no, everything in language is on these axes of metaphor and metonymy. And, well, guess what? Metaphor and metonymy are two kinds of analogy.
Yeah.
Right? There's literally just two kinds of it. And so it's like, well, then that might give us the sort of like 0 and 1, so we can then kind of like play with like, oh, this is how analogy can compile in these different directions, I like that. I think there's something really cool there. But I also think that there's still probably something that a phenomenologist could do that's sort of post-Bourdieuian, even post-Baudrillardian, that still says, okay, but what are the fundamental conditions of intelligibility? No, possibility, conditions of possibility for subjectivity itself, regardless of any field, regardless of any habitus. And then also, there might be certain things that remain true across all fields, across all habituses. And these would be things like the like 99% of human beings are going to have this proclivity for language at a very early age. Like, we are very observant. We pick up on things as long as we're nurtured, as long as there's the actual engagement with other human beings, we'll pick up on language very quickly. And it's like, could that be about something in the structure of subjectivity that made us the kind of creatures that do things by analogy in the first place? Well, these are interesting questions to me. But then we could also, this is still, everything I'm saying kind of makes it still sound like there's this self-reflective, individualist, sort of scholastic philosopher, as opposed to this more Heideggerian, no, what are the existentialia that are constitutive for worldhood itself, which is itself the condition of possibility for Dasein being in the world, right? Like, which all of those existentialia in being in time that are developed are necessary, not sufficient, but necessary conditions for any kind of a meaningful life, right? Or at least they're supposed to be, right? That's the goal there, right?
Absolutely. And someone like Hofstadter, and I think the metaphor connection is exactly right. Like I.A. Richards had this experiment to the point where he would give different groups different metaphors for education. He would say, education is like a river. Another group, he'd say education is like a tree. And another one, he would say education is like a road. And based on the starting metaphor, the very philosophies of education that the classes generated were different, because it turns out metaphors are not merely decorations of ideas. They are frameworks in which ideas develop. And so metaphor, and Neil Postman will talk about this, the George metaphors, that other book I see, that are all, so metaphors really matter because they have this ability. In a weird way, metaphors can make you, by talking about something else, you can understand better what's in front of you, which is extremely weird. Now, for Hofstadter, the analogy and language are inseparable. Like language, like to talk about analogy as the set of all sets would be to say that that language is the set of all sets. Now, of course, language doesn't necessarily just mean speaking, but the ability to, like, I say the sound water, you have the memory of water. I have this kind of chain of events that really are not reducible to a simple causation. Like, there is no necessary reason why the signifier of water would make that memory appear within you, because for people who don't know English, it doesn't summon that, right? So whereas everyone in every nationality, if I hit in the face with a ball, there's going to be the ball bouncing off their face, right? There's a kind of universality to that causation, where the causation
Are you
of
sure?
language...
You should try it out. We should do some science.
We should do some science. It's probably just constant conjunction. Let's do it until it's otherwise. So we'll see. So likewise, there's something about the causality of language that actually is socially situated. Within that social situation, sure, every time you say water, it makes people think of the phenomenon of water, but that's only because of the habitus, right? But the point is that language, sound, water, memory. There's a the word water that I hear is like the memory of water. But then Hofstadter and Kripke and Joel was talking about this. That would basically mean that the reason language works is not because of definition, but more so memory and experience. Like, because you've had certain experiences, then when you hear the word water, you're able to have a memory of that experience. And here's the key: the intelligibility of the signifier is then set by the experiences you have had. But this would mean, if we were more, dare I say, intentional or artistic or creative about the experiences we have, then the kinds of analogous judgments or forms of intelligibility we could undergo could change. Like, a poet experiences the word water different than someone who is not a poet. They definitely have the memory, but they also see it as a material where the word can be moved around. You could misspell it. You could put it on the page in a different way. They see it as multidimensional, right? And if there's something about language that is tied to the very formation of the subject itself, because this is what's very interesting. So we have this Marcuse, Frankfurt, all this idea that the subject is merely discourse. It's a construction of discourse, right? Now, belonging again, we'll talk about the difference between discourse and rhetoric is based on McCloskey. And basically, you could say it's the difference between philosophical poetic discussion, free-flowing kind of cipher. We talk about cipher mentality, hip-hop cipher. The way language operates in a hip-hop cipher constructs the subject very differently than the way discourse operates, say, in the job market, right? And absolutely, human beings, human subjectivity is strongly influenced by language because it's not merely a matter of the information that it makes you think, but the habits of meta judgments, of analogous judgments that you get into when you face a word. You are taught to be algebraic by discourse, per se, if you use that distinction. Linear speech teaches you to think algebraically, not
Right.
situationally, not geometrically. But if you do the hip hop cipher, you come to experience language as a free floating signifier and a kind of Derrida. You as alive, as active. You also come to know that in the cipher, you never know what anyone's going to say. It could be the real. The real could come burst. The explode, like a flow could enter. There's a relationship of language in the cipher that suggests a different way of making judgments about what you're supposed to say. And suddenly, here's the funny thing. In the cipher of this kind of hyperactivity of language, the role of the subject becomes very apparent. You can't simply reduce the subject to the discourse because they are actively making judgments about the meaning of the terms and how to use the terms as they come on. But if you are habituated to a use of language that is always linear, that is always not bound to, say, the artistic or the poetic structure, then you don't have a relationship of language and therefore the formation of the subject that can be open-ended, right?
Mm.
Cipher mentality is basically, in my opinion, a suggestion of the possibility of a subjectivity that in learning how to use language in a kind of free way constructs themselves in an open way that is not so susceptible to capture in the Deleuzian sense, that is not so trained to fall into letting the capital do your meta judgments for you. Because that's another way to put it. If you don't own the mechanism of analogy, the mechanism of the meta judgment, that means you don't own your capacity to value things, right? Because if I say that cup has value, then I am saying that this object falls under a category of value of my own creation for some reason. You're making an analogy, right? If you cannot do that, then value is going to be, that's worth $10. That is where the value comes
And you'll
from because
believe
you're
it.
not
Yeah.
awake and you believe it. You have to be aware of the mechanism of analogy that is making language possible, that you formulate and train yourself into a habit of as you use the language, if you are to be free of the way the chit chat, Heidegger, structures the subject to experience things, right? So seeing, this is the funny move then, seeing language, there's all these philosophers obsessed with language, right? This kind of language and language philosophers and different things. And there's the language always differs. It's kind of empty in different things. Well,
Yeah.
actually, if we see language as always involving a meta judgment that is situated by the habitus of the society, that also forms your habits of intelligibility, then we can see a different relationship to language as possibly opening up different ways of valuing. And what does a philosophical discussion do? What do these, theory underground conversations, these liminal web spaces do? They train you to relate to language differently. They train you to have a different relationship to language, which as a result trains you to have a different relation to intelligibility, which then trains you into a different relationship of meta judgments, which is beginning to open the door of the possibility of different analogous aesthetic relationships to reality, therefore alternative value judgments. And once you have alternative value judgments, it becomes possible to then move beyond the capital form. Because if all you're going to do is erase the capital value form, well, then you fall into the anxiety of not having any direction, right? But if what you're able to do is create new maps, in these new backgrounds that you are operating and that you're choosing according to your own judgments, well, then you have something that other people can join you in to have intelligibility with you in those maps, but you're not just falling into chaos land. But that's going to arise from an awareness, I think, of this analogous activity. That capital simply is so powerful because it taps into and does basically it just does our intelligibility for us. What's a cup? $10. It does your intelligibility for you. It does your analogous judgments for you. That and pragmatism does your analogous judgments for you. You say, what's practical? This, okay. So that's the judgment. This is practical. That's an analogy. It is like a thing that I have been taught is practical. We let the world train us into things that do our analogous judgment for us. Therefore, we're trained out of the capacity to make our own horizon of intelligibility. Well, then that's that.
And then we can get into the whole idea that some analogies are better than other ones.
Yes.
But then
yes.
also some that are better are actually too good in a way that's misleading. And so that's complicated. And then of course, I think maybe something in what you're proposing is ultimately we're responsible. We have to figure it out. Because if you stay in a field and you're trying to derive its criteria and you're doing so consciously, so these are the self realization of those, the internalized objective, but now made explicit criteria by which excellence or achievement or something is measured within, one of these fields. You might realize if you actually were inhabiting lots of different fields that field has lost touch with its original subject matter or practice in the first place. And so that kind of is a nice segue into sociology. You are interested in sociology. I'm interested in sociology. I also realize that there is a distinction now between sociology and social theory. And the people who make that distinction are trying to kind of just have like this more empirical, statistical sort of approach called sociology. Of course, it comes with so many problems. There's so much responsibility that comes along with all of this because it's always already political and it's not scientific, right? It's not scientific in the sense that often people associate with that word, which means that it's not political, right? Well, politics is usually, or science is very usually political, right? That's what I was trying to say. And social science even more so, right? And we're not just talking about like, Democrats, Republicans, or something. Groups just have their own sort of commitments, right? To certain kinds of status quos or equilibriums of certain kinds of field arrangements or what have you. And of course that can come with like this sort of, didn't Thomas Kuhn suggest that it's a whole, a generation of people attached to a certain paradigm dying away slowly as that paradigm develops more and more contradictions. That is one of the big reasons that, yes, eventually someone's able to go, okay, none of these things are working. Let's reassess. Okay. So with that all said, then we're in a situation where we care about sociology, but it's suspect. It's not always so scientific. Someone like Weber or Bourdieu is going to try really hard to be critical and not scholastic or scientistic, but actually like, I use that Husserl, those Husserl quotes that I think were so impactful on Bourdieu, to say like, yeah, it's the attitude of science that he's going for, which is obviously lacking in a lot of my experiences with people who want to study it, and because the reason they want to study it ultimately is for their activism. And so I know that you've made this distinction between activist sociology and another kind of sociology, and you talk about this activist kind being sort of conspiratorial thinking as opposed to this other kind. So I wanted to, like, maybe you could elaborate for everybody just a little bit about how you think about sociology, and then we'll close this thing out in like 20 minutes. I didn't want to do this for too long because I got to get back to reading Mikey's book. Very excited about that. But yeah, man. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
But let's so a little bit about how you're thinking about sociology, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about another conversation we'll hopefully have where we'll get more into it, because I am preparing to teach that in the fall, and what I'm going to be teaching in the fall is for college students, and that's going to prepare me to do a bunch of stuff with it at a higher level with Theory Underground people next year. And I'll be teaching critical social theory while Benjamin Studebaker is teaching a Cambridge course on political philosophy all year long. So it's like the monthly subscribers at Theory Underground are just going to have this access to critical social theory and political theory basically at this Cambridge level, and then at this Dave level, which is questionable. It's like knockoff state school or something else. We'll see. Well, hopefully it's going to be really fucking cool. But I've hystericized myself to no end about what is social, what is political, what is scientific, and what are the prereqs for being able to make progress in these fields, or what's a responsible way of inhabiting these fields for people who do want to either understand and or change the world.
Outstanding. And everyone should pick up Mikey's book when it comes out. His work, there's quite a lot at the end of Belonging Again 2-1 talking about his work with Nick Land. So an incredible scholar, and very happy that his book is coming out. On that question of sociology. So one of the issues, so it's interesting because one of the problems is, in reality, economics, sociology, politics, and all of these things actually are cross-pollinating and influencing. And this would be the kind of one of the problems of specialization, is it creates this notion that these things exist in a vacuum, and they never do. Because if we follow, say, a Karl Polanyi, who talks in The Great Transformation, of the notion that if you're going to have market economies, you have to have market societies, and market societies don't exist in nature. You have to train people to think according to markets, or mainly capital, right? Mm-hmm. Well, this would mean the economy would actually not be intelligible to people as a mode of exchange unless they are sociologically conditioned to think according to the analogous judgment of, this is like something else. This cup is worth $5. This grain is worth 5 furs, right? So there's a meta judgment that has to be socialized into people, or otherwise economies don't work. Oh, and then Karl Polanyi's point would be economies, capitalism, without going too much into the argument, capitalism has a certain instability that forces it to become global capitalism. As global capitalism, that means you have to have law and international trade. Well, that means you have to have a state. Well, then you see how economy bleeds into socialization, bleeds into government, and you cannot separate these things. And this is where Karatani talked about the capital nation state. And that's simply the reality. And so they're always bleeding into one another. And in the same way that the lady who did, How the World Made the West, talks about, we need to end civilizational thinking. Like, civilizations don't really, there is no single civilization that exists outside of the encounters with other civilizations. So likewise, there's a notion we need to remove thinking of fields outside of cross-pollination. Now, there is a question, though. There must be enough civilizational distinction for one to experience a given aesthetic in Europe versus Asia versus India. There are different legal frameworks. So in the same way that the creative generation of the ideas of this is kind of the distinction I make. It would seem as if the creation of nations exerts in a kind of cross-pollination and counter silk roads. But then as it goes along, it solidifies through a government and legal framework that then separates it from the ecosystem of cross-pollinations with the Persian Empire and Europe and all of these things that made that possible to be kind of split off. So in a sense, you could say you have this river of encounters and exchanges, and then governments put their hands in the river and pull up a cup of water and say, that's Europe, or that's Mongolia. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? Now, what's funny enough, if Dietrich McCloskey and all these, and Schopenhauer and all these different people are correct, that capitalism only functions to generate wealth if it actually engages that creative flow, then in a weird way, the very act of pulling a civilization out of that flow and calling it like capital then dooms the capitalism to become auto-cannibalistic. And that is where I want to talk about how capitalism has a tendency to falling into the inability to create demand. It can only stimulate demand. Once it can only stimulate demand because it can't create demand because it's cut itself off from the creative flow, and then it's going to have low growth rates and political turmoil, et cetera, and you get all these problems. So anyway, so sociology for me, Martha Nussberg has this lovely book called The Fragility of Goodness, where she says the reason why politics is screwed up today is because we don't have the category of tragedy, because none of our books teach us tragedy, and a tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. You go to Sophocles, are you going to serve the gods or are you going to serve the nations in Antigone? Like a lot of the great literature she talks about shows people having to make decisions where neither option is entirely good. And if you choose one, you lose the other, and you somehow have to figure out a live, active balance between these things that could change on the historic moment. So, for example, do you want privacy or do you want protection? Choose. Because the more I can make you very safe as the government if you remove all your privacy. Do you want that though? No. But then does that mean you don't want any safety at all of any capacity, right? And if you say, well, I'm okay with it, what if your neighbor's not? And then you have to live in the same civilization as them and reach negotiation between people with different mixtures of those various values. So the point that Martha Nussberg is getting at is that if we think about politics as problems and solutions versus trade-offs of competing goods, and the trade-off for 1977 may be different from 2014, which may be different from 2021, and it's live changing. If we're not thinking about that, democracy is doomed. Because the politicians and the civilization will never, ever, ever be able to offer solutions to all of the problems. And if you think the role of politics is to solve all the problems, when they don't, that will then remove their legitimacy. You'll rebel. You'll try to put in a government that solves all the problems, which by definition cannot exist. And then you have a pathological society. Sociology has mostly as a conspiratorial, power-hungry, power-spotting field is a problem solution way of thinking. Let's spot where there's power. Let's spot where there's oppression. Let's remove it, and we're good to go. The issue with that is it's actually a neoliberal paradigm where the more you simply increase freedom, the more people are happy. This is not the case. The more you increase freedom, the more miserable people might be, and they actually might be anxiety overwhelmed and vulnerable to a strongman, right? But then, if you don't question power at all, then you end up oppressed and controlled and bound by objective fictions, right? Sociology should be a tragic sociology, which is a study of the various trade-offs between givens and releases, to use that language from Philip Reeve, from the Triumph of the Therapeutic, between things that you freely choose and then the society of which provides a horizon for your free choices. And it is actively assessing that movement of variables in history and trying to think that, not simply free people from power, because this is what Philip Reeve, Peter Berger, all of these different people warn about. If you free people from all their maps, then they are overwhelmed with existential anxiety, and that's precisely when they turn to nationalism or popularism or totalitarianism. And if you simply say, well, they shouldn't, then you have that's called force. It's inevitably going to turn into a reaction against the popularism of power, like where you have to stop them and use force, because people don't just change because you say don't, because you've removed the givenness of their immanent framework, of their deepest beliefs, and you've made, Charles Taylor, I think, said nobody appreciates their story being trashed. You've said their story is stupid and oppressive in the very way that they define their family life. And maybe it is oppressive. Maybe it is bad. But saying that directly to people doesn't tend to create the result that you want. You have to create the environment where they can encounter the shortcomings of their worldview to be formulated by that encounter with their own limits, so they can then choose on their own to change. So you create an environment.
I was just talking about how there's like two options. You have Tyrion Lannister, and he can read a bunch of books to sharpen his mind, or you have Jon Snow, and he can sharpen his sword. Okay, that's the two options. Guess what? If Tyrion's gonna go around and be a spicy little, anti-populist, like actually like, oh, I hate the people. Well, that'd be like Joffrey shit, man. Everyone's gonna want to kill you. Like, what are you talking about? And it's like, well, yeah, maybe if you've got the might and the force and you think that that's the way to go, but it is like, I don't know. I don't know. There is something about modern activism that is very, like you're saying, conspiratorial. It's trying to spot power and oppression. Oh, we can spot it, if we can name it, the institution can fix it. It's always assuming the institution. The language of marginalization, actually, and Walter Ben Michaels is really good for this. The language of it is assuming that like, oh yes, the problem for X, Y, or Z group of people is that they've not been centered by these institutions. And it's like, well, these institutions are garbage, man. Like we actually don't want, no, we need new institutions. And you've been historically held back. Well, but guess what? Even if you weren't historically held back, you'd still be fucked right now. That's the part that is getting covered over in that whole conversation. Is like, no, inclusion's not going to save you because it's inclusion in hell. So we actually need to restructure. And when I say, I'm not saying restructure like, okay, dictatorship of the proletariat or I'm saying like there need to be literally new institutions built. And, I'll always go to the example of, building institutions on the busiest spots on all of the borders of the world. And those institutions should be educational centers and places where people can live for potentially the rest of their lives if they want to, and if they just want to, and families should be able to be families and do liberal arts as well as like practical kinds of skill building things. But that's also part of a move towards a society that has more educational and actually cosmopolitan kinds of institutions. Well, the wonderful thing about having these kinds of institutions on borders is that on the left, the progressive left, everybody's already like, oh, climate crisis disproportionately impacts people in the global south, and oh my god, and that would take care of them, and that would take care of that issue a lot better than just saying get rid of the border, which then causes this reaction of like hyper nationalism, which is just like absolutely not, motherfucker. And it's like, well, I mean, it's both responses are disproportionate and kind of cartoonish. And what I'm talking about is like, yeah, but most people who are generally leftish would be like, yes, that sounds like a nice alternative to just abolish the border and move everybody through faster or whatever. And then as opposed to completely closing it off and sending everybody within who's not originally from back home, like this fantasy, which is the other extreme, should also be able to get behind these kinds of institutions. And then connecting those kinds of institutions with libraries and moving the liberal arts and the humanities towards the libraries so that we actually just have like public lecture kind of culture and multimedia kind of center, hybrid, not just internet, not just IRL kinds of institutions that are able to create learning webs between rural towns in the middle of Virginia or Idaho or where have you, with border towns that are becoming like these educational city hubs. Like that's a forward direction and a lot of money that's going to be wasted on wars and lobbying and the stupid duopoly that we have today. All of that shit could be going towards these things. And these would actually kind of teach a person how to fish as opposed to, here's your unlimited access, but also no supports, no tools, no ability to actually have any self-respect or make anything of yourself in this society, right? Which is the current progressive position, which is insane. But that's not like I said, that's the activist position. That's not the standard progressive position. The standard progressive is a lot more rational, right? Like the standard progressive is just like, the sending people back where they came from is fucking bullshit. We're all from other places, right? Like there's that kind of, but realize, but border abolition is going too far. Like that literally is creating its inverse here. And so, I don't know. To me, I think that what you're talking about, this tragic, the trade-offs and tragedy, entering that into sociology seems really important. And it's like the sociological teenager is like stuck at Bourdieu and Foucault. And it's like, yes, but now it's time to go through subjective destitution and realize imperfection all the way down, injustice all the way down, slavery and genocide in the DNA of everything, everywhere, all at once. Don't try to bracket out or save as, some special exception, some ideologically loaded historical example of some people who supposedly weren't, genocidal at some point in their history. We fucking weren't there. I don't believe it because I understand how zero sum ultimatums occur when right makes might is the actual logic, lizard brain logic behind the state, and needing to control for fortune or reduce the degree to which fortune plays into things and preempting the directions that things will go in if fortune takes things one way or another. Like, this doesn't just go back to Machiavelli. It goes back all the way through all of political philosophy. I think it's every statesman or statescraft person has always known these things. And so it's to me, it's like living in a supposedly democratic society makes it so that to even have a conversation about the situation we're in where everything has become political makes it so that then we start doing this thing where we're pretending we are those statesmen. And it becomes like fantasy football, but like we get to reference books and it's fun. We're not statesmen. Now there's, hey, maybe somebody, stumbles upon this video and word gets around and then like one of these ideas. Yeah, I do not stake hopes on such things. I have actual goals on like a project, right? Like we're talking about institution building of our own that breaks out of this binary between people who have all the schole and people who don't have any of it, and breaks out of this political ideological duopolistic vicious cycle between cartoonishly one-dimensional sides that don't represent the overwhelming majority of humans who are flawed, but ultimately a lot more reasonable than our supposed representative classes are making us out to be. Right? That's kind of where I'm coming from and what I'm thinking of. But we'll be closing out here in a couple minutes. I want to give you some kind of closing thought space here. By the way, I'm really stoked to look into Hofstadter and Sanders' book. I'm actually stoked because I like Hofstadter, not for the Gordian,
Goldelbach-esque thing.
Thank you, that one, which is the famous one, but it's this book he wrote about translation, which is really cool. Elton put that one on my radar. And also I found out that Illich was friends with Erich Fromm and also the guy you keep bringing up that you love, which is Peter L. Berger, yeah. Right? Yep. And so that's a really cool connection that I didn't know about. But also Bourdieu like references Berger and stuff like that. Like there's actually some kind of thing there. So that's really cool. And I guess Berger's kind of like an inheritor of phenomenology within the realm of sociology. So I guess as a way of passing it back to you, I'll just then ask, do you think that this towards not strictly, trying to spot power or oppression kind of approach to sociology, this trade-off and tragedy approach, do you think that it is embodied in someone like Berger? And to the degree that it is or is not, how does our situation change? The situation has changed, and so now to be a sociologist, it's very different when he was writing in the 50s and 60s, right? And so it's one of the things that I've been trying to think about as I work through his invitation to sociology. Is like, it's interesting because he's talking about like, oh yeah, people don't really have jokes about sociologists. People don't know anything about sociologists. And I was like, oh yeah, this book's old. He was like, because it's like, no, sociologists are like the butt. I think they're more the butt of the joke than the philosopher at this point. And it's like, oh, you mean activists? You mean like literally like the major that I will be teaching for is advertised to people as want to change the world? Study sociology. And it's like, so it is like recruiting for activists. And it's like, well, that should be good. But then I would think that it would require some serious time spent doing political philosophy and philosophy of science. I would think like those would be prerequisites, I would think. So, but anyway, yeah. How does Peter Berger set us up for thinking a philosophy or a sociology of trade-offs and tragedy?
Magnificent. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Dave, and thank you also with the power going out and running to a different and working with that. I really appreciate it. So this might be the only time you get this blurred background, everyone. So exclusive on different things. So there's a few things that come to mind. There's a way also in which sociology, if philosophy has something to do with thinking about thinking, sociology arose when we thought about thinking to the point where we realized that thinking was always not just individually bound, that it entailed a whole world inside of itself called a society. Wow. And so sociology is a kind of natural next step to philosophy, because when you think about thinking, you come to the place where you eventually realize that it's already situated by a social unconscious, and so it is fitting for philosophy to move into sociology. And then, if there's something about philosophy that is offering alternatives to the logic of capital leading to the Dark Enlightenment and Nick Land, then there's something about sociology that recovering could actually be offering an alternative to the logic of capital. Because when you think about something like time energy is not a phrase that is reducible to economics, but it also involves economics. It revolves the society, but it also involves your own individual relation that is already situated in a nexus of interaction, right? And so I also don't think it's by chance that a lot of the philosophy today is very what? Relational. There's this Whitehead or Metamont. There's all this talk about relations being real, or Gilchrist. There's this kind of relation is central. Well, yeah, that would be the metaphysics you would expect to become tangible if philosophy was always in a way unfolding into more of a sociological understanding. I think another way that I would put it, to getting into the burger question. Oh, and before I forget, sociology, if you take it seriously, is the realization that the world is more so a product of imagination than rationalization. And you see, rationality follows based on the value form we have imagined, by which we then habituate our analogous judgments relative to. We imagine that this cup is worth $10, and then it becomes rational to sell cups for $10. But rationality follows relative to what we imagine. And imagination, if it is not located in interaction, tends to be limited by what you can think. And you're probably already situated within a logic of capital that you're not free from. So your imagination will be very bound to figuring out how you can participate in the pre-existing logic. So you cannot imagine alternatives. Hannah More, who was a abolitionist who worked in Britain with the slave trade, she really stressed at the end of her book that imagination makes the world. Ethical revolutions are matters of imagination, not people becoming more rational. Because imagine that the minority is a human as well. You can always come up with reasons why they're not. They don't look like us. They don't act like us. So they're not as civilized. But just imagine for a minute that they're actually a human being. Oh, wait, actually, yeah, that could work, because when we imagine that, we actually can interact. Look, all the rationality that follows gives us better results of how a society works, right? But you start with imagination and then you model. You were talking earlier about how sociology, the problem is economic sociology, politics are always model-based now, which means they're trying to, I think a lot of times when they talk about a science, they mean guaranteed results. If we know enough information, we have a model, will be like the cause and effect will follow just as much as billiard balls going across the table, right? Modeling denies the indivisible role of human imagination in human civilization. An imagination that follows from our valuations are the invitation, if we invite people into these things we imagine and create, to share in a different social horizon than what is simply given by the economic system. Sociology should be the revelation that markets only work if you make people imagine the world according to a market society, planier, that ethical revolutions are not because humans become more rational. No, they start imagining that the minority is just like them. They read books. Like when you look at all these ethical revolutions, it's amazing how often an artist or a poet is at the center of it. It's not that suddenly everyone become really rational and realized, oh man, eugenics is bad. A lot of the scientific consensus before World War II actually were very eugenic. But then there were images of the Holocaust. Then there was an aesthetic experience and a reality that people encountered that made them reason differently. Sociology should be taught to show that if you go through history, you see a role of imagination that is trying to imagine a better way to deal with the tragic human condition we cannot avoid. Okay, we cannot have both full protection and full privacy at the same time. What is a better way, though, to balance those things? What is a better way, though, to exist with those tensions? Okay, human beings cannot be reduced into the whole without there being an alienation. But if there's no whole at all, then we're atomized individuals and we can't relate to one another. Okay, can we imagine a different way that human beings can interact to somehow show that the human person does not reach fullness outside of a communal relation? And this would also be what I would say. We talked at the beginning about Goggins, and I know we're coming to the close, and again, I really appreciate it. We're very much looking today for models of how to individually live a life. This will never change the value form. What we need to look for is different models of how to interact with other human beings. Models of interaction is where the new sociological horizons appear. Most people interact with one another in what way? Oh, what's your job? What's practical? Oh, do you think like me? One of the reasons why I actually think spaces like Theory Underground, Philosophy Portal, and the like are very important because they model a different way of interacting with people using philosophy in a different what? Language game, a different way of language, not discourse, but rhetoric. New ways of socially interacting is what the world needs to have modeled and to see. Because if you see people online talking philosophy or taking classes, even if they don't get a job, Alex Ebert talks about permissionaries, that then makes you say, wow, maybe I could do that as well. We need models of different ways to interact, not models of just individuals overcoming their traumas. Now, of course, communities require individuals to come into them having done a certain work. So someone like a Goggin can be very useful to help you come to terms with your own trauma and say, you know what, I don't care if the world tells me that I can't rise up to the occasion. I'm going to rise up to the occasion. So that has a role. But then the problem is right now, there are not enough models of interaction so that people can transition from individual empowerment into communities that are empowered. And so then they just withdraw back into an individual atomization, right? So individual exemplars need to flow into exemplars of way to interact that are not reducible to commodity form. And if indeed there is something about pragmatic exchange, the logic of capital that leads to the AI and the loss of the human being, then the way that we actually maintain the human being as distinct from the AI and the dark enlightenment is precisely by unique forms of interaction that are not reducible to economic exchanges, that are modeled in philosophy, and that sociology was unveiling was actually at the foundation of every economy, every society. At the birth of all of these things was an imagination that emerged from an interaction on a Silk Road between different kinds of people who imagined a different way to interact and to be together. And this is what leads to changes in conditions of possibility, because you're aware that, wow, what we imagine is then going to form a social unconscious by which intelligibility is possible. So let's get really, really good at imagining and choosing the kind of institutions we're going to create, because they're going to incubate us into certain habits. And if we're not careful, the habits we will be incubated into will be the ones that make us only able to make the world intelligible in a manner that makes us fall into the Kafka trap of a dark enlightenment. If you do not want that, if you would like to avoid that Nash equilibrium and multipolar trap, then one will have to imagine alternative value forms. And I think models of interaction, such as Theory Underground, are indeed an invitation to that kind of sociology and social interaction.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Yeah, and with that, everybody, that's Daniel Garner of OG Rose. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Subscribe to OG Rose. Follow OG Rose on Instagram. Michelle runs the account over there, does a great job. And also, look at the screen right now, folks. What you see on the screen is the thumbnail for this video, and it's got us with the social unconscious over that, basically that other thumbnail from the video that played before this. And so it was premiering all day today. And so the reason I put it up on the screen is I want everyone to know it is available on podcasts. It is available here on Theory Underground's YouTube channel. And check it out. If you're a member at Theory Underground, we're going to be having a conversation about the LaComfort crisis and David Goggins and desire and drive and the social unconscious, just with everybody who's thinking about it, who's trying out the various experiments that we're putting into practice here at TU. And that's happening this coming Sunday. And then after that, guess what happens? Todd McGowan's teaching seminar 11 for all of July. And I'm teaching some courses. I'm teaching some, I'm doing some lectures with Mikey. We're going to be building off of everything we've already been building up to this year. And we're also going to have a couple of guest lectures from Benjamin Studebaker. So plenty to look forward to. Make sure to subscribe. And thank you, everybody. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you all. It's been a treat.
All right. Peace.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of the bullshit and just want to get down to it. Big ideas, rigorous thinking, and ultimately liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. Besides a commitment to publishing certain underground theorists and popularizing certain fundamental concepts, we have toured the United States and are touring Europe to promote our ideas, courses, and publications. You've been reading Underground Theory.
Amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run and review books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture this scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Time Energy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first, obviously, I have to get freed myself, so the two of us are able to do this because, you know, as Mikey said, build it and they will come. Well, I tried and I built a website and platform. I had my own app and everything, but it's been really buggy and it's more than one person can handle, and that's, you know what, a really good lesson for me. And so for now, what we're doing is moving it to a temporary intermediary platform until we are able to get some more serious funding. And ultimately, we want to be in a place like this, a real brick and mortar, digital nomadic mecca where people can come. Okay, we're live again.
Outstanding. No, the thing with Peter Berger is that he's too conservative for liberals and he's too liberal for conservatives, because he's honestly looking at how, another way to put this is philosophy, I guess Aquinas or Aristotle, they talk about as the doctor of the soul, right? There's a way in which sociology should be the doctor of objective fictions, in a way. How do we think objective fictions? And also the critical notion, and Schumpeter talks about economics as creative destruction. Everything is creative destruction, which is a following of the subject. There's an argument that subjectivity itself formulates like a creative destruction. It's not merely like what is created destroys what is previous, of which makes possible new destructions. And this is why you have this lack feature to the subject that also, though, seems to formulate but then destroy itself in that formulation. And creative destruction seems to be what society is. It seems to be what economics is. But that's why keeping the discourse going is really important, because whatever is destroyed, you keep creating or you keep destroying, and you need to think that way. But then you need to avoid calcification. So someone like a Peter Berger, he's really not, he's also, when he says stuff like, if you, if you free people from religion, they may turn to fascism. People hear that and say, oh, he's saying that we shouldn't go from religion. That's your automatic interpretation. No, he's more just describing what people do. Like, if you remove religion, their worldview, they tend to be prone to strongmen. That's not saying it's good or bad. That's just what human beings do when they lose their eminent framework, right? But because the problem is most people go into books thinking that the person has an agenda. Like, you could say that Peter Berger, in a way, almost is a victim of the very conspiratorial thinking of his field, right? Where he's just, you see, so you're saying, oh, well, you're just trying to defend conservative values. It's more like, he's like, no, what I'm trying to tell you is that if you want to change society, it's like that board game of Operation, where you got to like pull out the piece and not hit any of the sides, right? Like, you've got to be aware of that. In a way that what Peter Berger is talking about is very similar to Coratani. He's like, oh, you want to change the nation? Well, the state's going to rush in to fix that. Oh, you're going to change the economy? Well, the nation's going to rush in to fix that. Like, it's a triplex of mutually reinforcing dimensions that if you're not aware of that whole, then you're just going to infinitely go back and forth. And so, like, yeah, so there's basically, like, if you assume, for example, that there's always going to be some percentage of conservatives and some percentage of progressives and some percentage of X, Y, and Z or whatever, then the name of the game of politics and sociology cannot be to educate people out of their stupid views. The role of, because that's basically what we think. Education is about making people more rational, right? This is a mistake, because rationality is always situated in an axiom or worldview or pre-existing non-rational map. Rationality is always defined by what you believe is true. And I cannot reason you out of your truth, because your truth is the basis of your reasoning. So it's underneath any reasoning. Now, what I could do, here's the trick. You can change people, though, with encounters of otherness, of devastation, of beauty, of models of interaction. What is one of the main ways that you have an ethical revolution? By making people who said, oh, they're evil over there, well, go talk to them. They go and talk with them. They're like, oh, I guess they're humans too. Like, one of the best ways you convince people out of their bigotry is by actually having them encounter the other person, and it humanizes them. But if you try to rationally educate them out of their view, you'll never get there. But if you have them encounter the other person and do it in a manner, then that has a big impact. Now, I'm not going to like say it's a magic trick. No. I'm not going to say it always works. No. But you cannot separate encounter and relationship from intellectual development. That's why models of interaction.
I would also just add that all these liberals seeking these sort of transformative encounters from, let's say, for instance, people of color, which this, like, they treat it like this sort of like sacred commodity, right? Like, oh, I want it, but also I can't show that I want it. So I actually have to say that I don't want to be invited to the cookout. Like, this whole thing that comes with it, right? I don't think that helps. Right? Like, it makes it so that they can't have the encounter. I don't know. Like, humans have to have encounters around actual goals, like real practical goals in their lives. And if the only goal is the encounter, well, there's like, well, what kind of person shows up for that kind of, to be the recipient of that kind of treatment?
So so if indeed people cannot really be educated, so now there are random people who can, but if you're saying the majority, which I think is very fair, the majority of people, you do not use rationality to leave their worldview, because rationality is always serving of a truth that is pre-rational, that is non-rational. So you can't get under that. It has to be, well, ultimately, it has to be an encounter that transforms their meta judgment and their analogy, their relationship of valuation. You change people's truth by changing how they value things. But how do you do that if the value act comes before the reasoning act, right? Well, it has something to do with encounters, subconscious associations, and things like that. And how do you get the average person to be more willing to Well, because if you encounter true diversity, that reflects on you to make you realize, oh my gosh, I could have been born a Hindu. I could have been born different. So there's annihilation that occurs to your worldview that's a source of anxiety. So you have to be trained to be ready for that anxiety and actually see it as a liberation. Because, hey, if being is groundless, then there's creative possibility that then I am free to create objective fictions as opposed to just be there, just serve them unconsciously, right? For me, I think it has a lot to do with the social unconscious. And the question is, where does the social unconscious come from? The valuations of the social conscious. I like to talk about, in belonging again to the difference between the material condition and the medium condition. Now, the medium condition is a material condition, but the medium condition is the incubation of your associations. And the example I like to use all the time, because I think it's very powerful, from Neil Postman's book, The End of Education, is the classroom. When you go into a classroom, the logic of the classroom, because the medium is the message, following McLuhan, it says that an educated person is good at trivia. That's what it means to be educated. And so you subconsciously associate a conversation being a trivia exchange. It's not an emergent phenomenon. It's not about encounter. In the classroom, you don't encounter your classmates, really. You're all looking at the teacher. It's a neurotic structure in that Lacanian sense, right? If every person in America, though, theoretically, went to a classroom that was organized to make you associate being educated, being rational, if you will, with interacting with the other person through oral conversation on questions of which nobody in the classroom knows the answer to, because we're trying to think through problems that the teacher doesn't have the answer. They're just facilitating a discussion about what we should do about the border. That was an example, or the economy, or different things. And it's a lot. You're exercising imagination. You're exercising active thinking. You're listening to other viewpoints. And here's the key. All of that then gets associated with what it means to be educated. So that medium, the medium condition, changes your association of what it means to be an educated person. And it's much more now aligned with the encounter act and the speech act, of which is more of a cipher, like a hip hop cipher structure, right? Right now, we're basically, if you want to be, because, educate, everyone stresses education. Well, you're literally subconsciously taught to associate education as an authoritative structure. You go to an authority and they teach you something, right? So that is what people think is a good use of time, is if you're going to learn, right? So this greatly decreases the probability that people would conclude that it's a good idea to go engage in conversations, open-ended philosophical encounters with diversity, because they have a subconscious association of that's what you do. That's what it means to be educated, right? Like right now, so there's a subconscious association of philosophical discourse as impractical, as a waste of time, as specialist, right? If philosophy was simply the rhetoric of education, like, because philosophy is the way of talking about education. That it is the act of thinking through ideas, live situation. Philosophy is a mode, right? If being educated is having the philosophical mode, then it would not be seen as impractical or wasting time or silly to do it. It would be seen as necessary for thinking through critically on problems at work, at home, at everything. Philosophy becomes the necessary mode of meeting the world so that you can think it through in a manner that is actually able to deal with problems or address horizons or different things, right? But that's the medium condition. And here's what the reason why I think that distinction is important is because if we say, well, the problem is the material condition. Well, yes, I'm definitely not going to tell you that economics don't matter. But if you give people money, change their material condition, but you don't change the medium condition by which they subconsciously formulate their values, they're still going to operate according to the logic of capital. All you're doing is helping them function in capital, but you're not opening imaginative possibilities. And you are certainly not training them to deal with anxiety. You are certainly not training them to deal with otherness. And if we take geopolitical issues seriously, the inability of nations to deal with otherness and difference without going nuts will have major geopolitical consequences, right? But you are literally actually taught, like, honestly, if we read a lot of without going too much into it, when you read a lot of the biographies of diplomats all throughout history, diplomacy is really far more of like a philosophical engagement, not just a pragmatic engagement. Like good diplomats try to understand the world that the other nation and civilization occupies. And they try to think through their values, not simply ask, do you want oil? Do you want like freaking semiconductor chips or something? That, of course, is you get to that but basically, you can't even have a useful, constructive discussion of the material condition if you haven't been incubated by a medium condition that could help you think according to non-siloed values about the material condition. And that's where, that's where the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal Fukuyama, that was the big mistake, because it was the kind of idea that, well, no, markets are rational for all civilizations all around the world. We don't need to understand other civilizations. We just need to introduce them to the truth. Then they will see it and they will change. So there was no need. So all we need to do is tell them about, like a trivia game. We have the answers. You just ask us, we'll give you the answers. It's like the trivia structure. It's not moving into a philosophical discussion with other nations, right? So it has these subconscious associations have geopolitical, diplomatic implications, certainly on the work site, because you're also the work structure. The hierarchy at work simulates the hierarchy in the classroom. It has the same structure. Well, if you went through school and the structure of interaction was not hierarchical but cipher, and here's the key: a hip hop cipher does have a hierarchy, but it emerges from the skill, not from the certification. Like hierarchies and the kind of vertical hierarchies of the classroom is based on a position. The teacher could be terrible, but they're still the teacher, right? Hierarchies of a hip hop cipher emerge of, oh wow, yeah, Kendrick Lamar is the best. Of course he is. Like you see that, like it comes out of it, right? But then the guy who's the best in this cipher today may not be the best tomorrow. So you have a fluid hierarchy, right? This is the key. There's a feeling of, because the problem is usually not hierarchy so much as is the feeling of a rigid hierarchy, an unmoving hierarchy, or a hierarchy you're stuck in, right? You could almost talk about the difference between hierarchy and ladder, right? And that's the American, the whole idea of the American dream was a ladder, and we all know that was captured as a narrative to control people. But generally speaking, people know that you could win this wrestling match and tomorrow you may not, right? You could climb to the top today and tomorrow fall. There's a kind of fluidity to it, right? A cipher structure allows where you don't have this kind of naive, everyone has like the same, right? But you also don't have a certain permanent position that leads to tyranny, right? Because it's based on the movement. Well, that is a association of how authority works live and emergently in the structure that could be incubated in people to bring to the job site, to bring to the political site, to bring into every authority structure, because that was what was incubated in them by the classroom. And this would be my main point. If we read a Peter Berger seriously, if we read the Sociology seriously, then what they're saying to us is that we need to think medium conditions real freaking hard, because our lives are determined by social unconsciouses that we don't know we're there, that are now becoming vivid to us, and we don't know what to do with them, and we need to design them. And you see, here's the trick. That's how you escape the dark enlightenment. If you do not think designing social unconscious, then your unconscious will be capital. And that means AI. That means the logic of AI. The only way, and also the key to designing the social unconscious, that's not a plan. That's an active preparing. That's what Ivan Illich is talking about. When Ivan Illich is like, you can't plan against a structure of planning. You can't create a new vertical rigid hierarchy to replace rigid hierarchy. So it's like, well, what do we do then? Well, we hope. Well, hope is active. By hope, he's mean let's create these alternative institutions, schooling, enablement, useful unemployment. Let's create these new because those are mediums. Those are mediums. Like those are ways of associating. Wait a minute. Like useless employment can actually develop me as a subject to create value that I can't get within a crude pragmatic paradigm. Wow, there's value here, right? That changes your analogous judgment, your association, right? Which then changes what you're doing in the present that makes you prepared for the future precisely because you're not planning the future. That distinction between preparing and planning, I think, is big for me. Sociology should have been the revelation that humans need to really focus more on preparing for the future, not planning for the future. Because planning for the future is always already situated within a social unconscious you don't know is there. That means in a way you're going to get trapped in a Nash equilibrium. It's like the future AI controlling us without, that's how rationality functions, right? Like it's this beast in the, what's that? The Behemoth kind of story of this future creature and some whatever. It's like AI in the future is moving us toward its creation kind of idea. There's a very real sense in rationality does do that, because rationality is very sequential. And if you're stuck in a certain social horizon, it doesn't matter what you pick A, B, or C, it's still already framed on the path going that way. So you're kind of trapped. And basically, like, sociology should have been the revelation that if you want to not be forced to go down that road, then you have to be preparing, not planning. All plans are going to lead you to the end of the road you're already on. That's the problem with planning. Planning can't get you on a new road. A plan, by definition, is going to assume the road you're on and continue down that road. To get on a new road, you have to prepare for the appearance of a road that you didn't know was going to appear and have the readiness to take it. Yeah. Well, that's encounterology. That's the value form. That's what Ivan Illich is talking about, the subjects that can do that.
Okay, and so that was our interruption of the PSA that was rolling because we were having a conversation on the backside, and then when he started talking about the stuff that he was gonna say about Burger but forgot to kind of get to, I was like, let's just do it. Like that's the thing about the thing about pirate TV is we can make those kinds of choices, you know.
Yes, that's right.
I was prepared. I was prepared. The road presented itself, and I was like,
that's exactly right.
Yeah, I was like, we're live. Yeah. But I like the way that you've set up why Illich and literally Illich and McLuhan are both essential for understanding the situation, right? And it's that institutions are media, and of course technology is media, but institutions are technology, so it all relates, right? But that McLuhan says it right near the beginning of understanding media, and I bet I can't even reach this book right now, but I bet I don't have it marked up, and I can't even find it right now. But there's this wonderful line where he says that base and superstructure have inverted, and it's like that's how you know that in Toronto, even back then, there were proto bread tubers, probably Trotskyist ones, just like Swolitariat, who were like coming around and telling him, "Hey man, no man, we just got to change the base," and he's over here like, "Base and superstructure have changed place, baby." And a better way of saying it is to say, this is the base. Like the media is the base. And I will say it correctly. The mediums. Incorrectly is correctly, right? But the mediums that shape our social unconscious, that is base.
Yes.
So is the value form. So is all of the political economic categories, for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, the medium condition as the base means at the base is the thing that is incubating your associations of your analogy, ergo your meta judgments. It is the medium condition is what is framing the very way that you make the world intelligible. Like but the moment that is intelligible to you, it's accordant with the intelligibility you just were given to think that thought. So there's always a reflexive problem that's concealing itself as you're thinking it through.
So this was the thing that I was kind of hanging on throughout the whole last conversation, hoping to bring up, and it fits well here. And that is, how does legalism, morality, and self-worth get flattened into the same thing by the schooling institutions and potentially other institutions within that framework? Because Illich talks about that. He talks about the legalism, morality, and self-worth all like lose any sort of distinction for the person who's being schooled to believe that the exam is testing their actual knowledge, but it's also testing whether they are deserving, you know. But I'm curious how it might relate to everything you're doing with your Belonging Again project.
Yeah, no, it's actually quite well. The problem is, truth organizes values is a phrase that opens the conflict of minds. All values are already set in a horizon of a notion of what you believe is true, and the problem is like self-worth. Okay. There's a notion of self-worth that is found in you valuing yourself. There's the self-worth that is found in your achievement on the test, therefore the top of a mediocre, the improvement, you've earned it. So your self-worth is found in jumping through hoops that other people could not. Your self-worth is found in God. Your self-worth is found in the community. The problem is all of those can be described as what? Self-worth. And yet what they actually mean is radically different based on the truth that you believe. If you believe that school is a valid test that is universally like it's fair. If you believe schooling is fair, then that notion of self-worth is justified because it is not based on a corrupt system. Like you're deriving your notion of self-worth based on something that is just. So it's justified, right? And so the problem that what I think Ivan Illich really identifies is that institutions have to change the values that people hold to identify with the mechanisms of the institution, or otherwise you would just see them as controlling you and you might stop it, right? So the institution has to habituate you to associating self-worth with success on the test, right? And also there's a very interesting reflection in The River Out of the North, maybe like that last book that Illich did from an interview format, talking about the birth of contingency as having the necessary leading to the technological man today, which then Christianity gave rise to the notion of contingency, which is why Christianity, as the quote unquote best of things, can become the worst of things, because contingency then becomes the very thing that frees the individual from being separate from the world, atomization, then they can be controlled by the society. So there's a notion where institutions suggest that you could fail. They create a framework in which failure is intelligible. Because if you think about what does it mean to fail as a human being? Actually, if you I guess getting bit by a poisonous snake, like success and failure are like not things that a human being in nature would think about, right? Success and failure are categories that are meaningful to us because there's an institution of which defines what it means to be successful or not, making a lot of money, doing well on the test, right? And then success equals having self-worth, right? So you have to somehow convince people of value categories of which then in accepting then has them accept the truth of the institution. The institution becomes an institution this is the weird thing. An institution cannot be contingently an institution. It has to be realized. It has to be like, you know how they talk about law can't change? It has to be realized because if law changes, it's arbitrary. Like whenever a new law is added to the law, they somehow have to make a move where they say, well, actually, it was always there in the law. We just didn't realize it. And we just kind of brought it out from a pre-existing structure. Thus, the law doesn't change. It just realizes what's always there. And then funny enough, if there's an injustice in law, then you say, well, that actually was never law because it wasn't just. It wasn't true law, right? You do these weird moves that you do to make it seem like they're authoritative. Institutions do the exact same thing. Like schools that oppress people, you say, well, those aren't real schools. You lose the designation of reality and truth to legitimize the parts of the institutions that work, that then legitimize the arrangement of values like self-worth that keeps the individual entrapped by that institution. And so what has to happen is also the institution, I think for Illich, has to kind of replace the community, because in this kind of by institution, I'm not trying to say institutions are bad. I mean more like the system almost maybe is about like the schooling system, like the things that form people have to be that we're all part of the school, not that we're all part of like Lynchburg or Rustburg or whatever or Roanoke. No, we're all part of the public school system. We're all part of capitalism. That's our community, right? Well, you really then don't want to have ethics as a category be independent of self-worth, because ethics has something to do with your social like duties and obligations to your fellow man. Oh, that's a problem, because that means you might have obligations to something outside the systems that can't necessarily be made intelligible by the system. You know, the example he always makes, and Brian brought this up, is the man on the side of the road. Like the guy that you encounter, the Good Samaritan story that he uses so much, the guy who disgusts you, right? Ethics needs to be collapsed into self-worth because otherwise there's the possibility of an ethic arising on the encounter of the other, which would mean that there's the possibility of values outside the system. Oh, crap. If there's the possibility of values outside of the system, then it can't totalize you. It can't enclose you. And it's possible to imagine something outside of the system. And so this is where, for me, there's like what Illich, there's certain collapses of values. Like a good example, like Hegel makes the distinction. I think Illich this could get at the point. There's a difference between morality and like ethics. Today, people don't think there's a difference between those. They're all the same, right? That would be an example of a success of the system, because ethics have something to do with social intelligibility and interacting with other people. Morality could be your own code of honor, like your own preferential code of how you think you should act in the world, right? But if they're just the same thing, then there's only the individual, and an individual's success is contingent on how they do in the system, not how they relate with other people, and your self-worth then requires the system to exist, so you would never revolt, you can't revolt against it because it would remove the basis of your self-worth. So I think there are collapses of values that have in conflations of values and similes and make them all the same, fungible. You could talk about the fungibility of values, just like the commodity form. That is necessary for systems to have this enclosure effect. And so that then, to the point of what we were saying about thinking, which I think, because what I think Illich points at, because the way I have thought about Illich is a revelation of the necessity of non-rationality to avoid the apocalypse of Nash equilibrium. Now, that is a mouthful, but actually I think Illich is pointing to, if you don't have imagination in your rational system will end up in a Kafka story. You'll be a slave to the logic that is pulling you down that little hallway in a little fable, and you can't escape that. And that's what Illich said. That's what Illich understands, is that without something non-rational, something that is not reducible to a rational calculus, you're stuck. You can't escape Joseph. You're going to end up in a Kafka novel like Joseph K. or The Castle. Like, oh, Joseph K. has a lot of freedom. No, he doesn't, because he's already framed by the system. He makes a lot of choices, but he actually can't escape, just like that little mouse. I talked with Pavio on Kafka. Like, Illich and Kafka can be thought together quite well. And I think Kafka is far more useful than Orwell or Huxley, because Kafka shows you how oppression is a result of soft power more than force. And that is true. And Illich understands that without imagination, without this human element, this human creativity, this ability to think non-rationally, you are unable to escape power. But precisely because force isn't used against you, you will think you are free. This is the worst kind. There's a way in which, like, the very fact that, like, power is way more advantageous to the capital nation state than force, because force is ironically fragile. If I hold a gun to your head and say you must do X, that's way more fragile than you internalizing the need to do X. Like, all force has to transfer into power to be sustainable. This is what, like, Matthew Stanley was saying. This is what Zizek talks about. Like, force has to transfer into power. And this is what the sociologists also understood. But we took that. The problem is they were showing how power operated in lieu of force today. And we say, oh, well, that means power is oppressive. Yeah, it can be, but it could be that precisely because we're not getting the human element involved, the only manifestation of power is oppressive as opposed to creative. Like, what a Berger and all of these people as tragic sociology should show is power is what makes a society. The question is only if that power will be creative because of a human active involvement, or if it will be oppressive serving the system. And that's also what Ivan Illich understood. One of the reasons why he's kind of emphasizing preparing a new institution is because he's talking about humans that can relate to power differently, change how it operates in society and the social unconscious so that it can be creative as opposed to a Kafka story, right? And so this is where, again, and I'll finish with this, is that in systems have to have a conflation of values so that you don't question the system. So then when you think about the system, even when you critique the system, you do it within the horizon of intelligibility that the system has permitted to you to make you feel like you're free, but actually you are still trapped within the bounds of power. But since there is no force there, you do not think you're oppressed. And so likewise, when the value form or the social unconscious defines what it means to think, and then you think about thinking, the only way you can think about thinking is according to the social horizon of intelligibility you have been given. So then when you look to see the root of thinking, you're going to see confirmation that you're thinking well. and your entrapment is finished, right? Like when you say, well, let me think about if I'm thinking well. Yep, I'm thinking like a pragmatist. Yep, I'm thinking about what's going to make my career. I'm good at thinking, and you're done. You reflected on thinking in a manner to confirm that you're good at thinking according to the value system that's there. So you lose sight that there's actually a meta judgment that is always already assumed in that thinking. So even thinking about thinking just confirms your entrapment. And that is, I think, what sociology is a revelation. Like sociology, I'll close. But it's just so fun. Sociology is a revelation that if you're trying to think your way into the future is already set. Sociology is the revelation that if you want a different future, you have to imagine it and then create the medium conditions in which people will be formulated by that imagination, not informed that they ought to do it. Because the moment you inform people that they ought to do something different, they resist because their ideology says they don't. You have to formulate them by a different medium condition, which, for example, seeing models of interaction like liminal, like the friggin' theory underground, is precisely a model of a different form of interaction that creates a different medium condition that can help people then formulate according to an imagined different way of humans interacting that changes the future. That's the only way you change the future is through that imagination. Because if you're trying to think your way to the future, and by thinking you don't include the imaginative act, the value act, the meta-judgmental act, then your thinking is just tracing out a tract, a little hallway in a Kafka story that was already set and you were going down had you thought or not. And thinking will just make you feel like you're doing something when you're not. So you have to bring in the awareness of the sociological unconscious so that you can imagine different horizons of operation. And Peter Berger is pointing to that, but because he is tragic and we don't have tragedy as a category of our thinking, we can't understand what he's talking about. He has to be power spotting or trying to justify and saying power is okay when he's trying to describe the human condition as tragic. But if humanity cannot even think of their condition as tragic, then you can't understand what he's talking about in his book. And that's one of the problems where in my opinion, a lot of the best philosophers are operating according to a way of thinking about reality that if you're not in, you can't understand what they're saying. So you have to associate them with the other side. And I think that happened to Peter Berger.
Thank you for the little bonus. Little bonus visit here. It's very nice. Very nice of you to stay longer and grace us all with this. I know that this is like a water hose to me of where you're coming from with all the stuff that you've been working on. And it's very nice of you to try to pack the length of your giant project into a little tiny moment like this. But what the hell? Hold on. I just realized that this thing's still going off. The little pew, 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 pew. Yeah. Okay. I fixed it. But with that, now we really are going to close out. I'm going to go think about these things a lot and then get back to you on what we should do.
Divine.
Yeah. Be thinking, let's do something related to all this soon. To the folks who are in the chat right now, what's up? Good to see you all still.
Good to see all of you.
Yeah. Catch you all on the flip side. Peace.
It was a treat, Dave. Thank you, sir.
We cannot.
Oh, and I'm instead of rolling the PSA that I was before, I'm gonna roll the Illich one because that course is still going on, and we keep talking about Illich, so it fits here. Yeah, let's do that.
The program will resume shortly,
Let's go.
after this DIY commercial that is not for any sponsor other than ourselves. Thank you for watching.
Whether we are already fully in the grip of the techno-capital AI singularity or not, we likely feel as though there's not much we can do.
As allies of future generations, we aren't giving up so easily.
To quote the author of Manifesto, the Mad Farmer Liberation Front, we wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what our life and our children's lives may be.
This fear is not new. The question of technology, media, and institutions became unavoidable in the 20th century. Yet when we think of institutions, the most radical critiques people have encountered came from either Michel Foucault or Jürgen Habermas. These thinkers towered over the theory scene in the 1970s and 80s as radicals took their long march through the institutions.
When it comes to theories of social change, the tendency is to put our hopes in leaving the existing institutions, the current order failing, or some overnight revolution to bring us salvation. Otherwise, we lean in and do the best we can with what's afforded by the existing institutions. Reform or revolution, nothing ever changes, so we keep putting our hopes in education.
So progressives say, if only more people had access to better education, then that would solve the problems. But they have not thought seriously enough about the nature of our institutions, or this thing called education that they offer.
The most radical critiques of schooling that teachers encounter issue from Paulo Freire, Bell Hooks, and Henry Giraud, but none of these ever got to the root of institutions themselves. The theorist who did this was Ivan Illich.
Gaining brief stardom in the 70s, Ivan Illich was the father of the deschooling movement, inspiring hundreds of radical schools and generations of homeschooling parents. But this characterization of his work as the anti-school guy was his ultimate demise, for that only takes account of a surface level of his work. Illich was immediately misunderstood and quickly abandoned.
The issue goes far beyond schools. We spend our entire lives mediated through institutions that totalize, instrumentalize, and reduce humans, all of our possibilities, to something predictable, calculable, and exchangeable, easy to control. The interests of state and capital here overlap entirely. Our desires are thus turned into commodities and our time energy into labor power. Illich doesn't stop here, though, for institutions are not the whole picture.
When people think of schooling today, they think of studying for exams, not learning for the sake of learning. When people think of hospitals, they think of treating illnesses, not human-to-human care and well-being. When people think of transportation, they think of speed and efficiency, not the possibility of sustained, regular, and meaningful connections. When people think of reading, they think of collecting information, not lingering with an idea. The move from schooling to scolae requires serious inquiry into the conditions of possibility for this mode.
I'm calling for a sincere and earnest revival of Illich. While most introductions to Illich limit their engagement to his earlier works, a series of polemics against schooling and institutionalized consumer society, I want to go deeper and lead us to a more robust understanding of who and what a human is for Illich. With his help, we will reopen the question of what we are, what we can be, and the types of lives we are willing to give our time and energy to bring into being, if there are to be humans in the future.
This course begins on June 13th and goes through July 4th, 2024. It meets on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can enroll at theoryunderground.com/courses/Illich-1, or just click on the link in the description. For those who just want to spend a month really thinking about schooling and institutions, this is a fantastic way to do so. But for those who are looking to go deeper with a community of truth seekers who are going beyond the current theory scene to form an intellectual milieu, this is a fantastic way to do so, because the Theory Underground 2024 conference at the end of October 23rd through 27th is going to have special panels for presentations related to this course. Any student of this course will have opportunities to present, and those presentations can ultimately culminate in submissions that may be accepted into the anthology we are doing on the critique of schooling and education, to be published either at the end of this year or at the beginning of 2025.
Thank you.
We hope to see you there.